Hi everybody, and welcome to episode 22 of The Only Way is Ethics. And today we are joined by Dr. Paul Jewell. Paul, thank you ever so much for joining us. So we will crack on shortly and ask you some questions around digital health. That's why we're here. I'd just like to say to the audience, welcome back. We've just had our Women in Health Tech Month for February, which was really successful. And now we're back into the fold of the individual episodes for The Only Way is Ethics. So I'll hand over to you, Paul. Welcome to the episode. And in true sort of podcast style for The Only Way is Ethics, it's for you to give us a bit of your background as a clinician and your journey into digital health and where that's brought you to now, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Dean, and hi to everyone who's listening or watching. Great to be here, and yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on. So yeah, I'll get right into it. Feel free to stop me if I go into anything in too much detail, but I'll give you a bit of a backstory.
You're right. You crack on.
As you said, a doctor by background. I've worked in the NHS now for over 8 years. I still practice clinically, doing some locum work, mainly based in London. Clinically, I practice in medical specialties, so respiratory medicine, acute medicine, and kind of my involvement in digital health and health tech goes all the way back to medical school, about 2016, when I was involved in my first project, and kind of been involved in various projects and ventures since. And then it was kind of a couple of years ago where I really wanted to skill up in AI and development, and off the back of learning more about machine learning and artificial intelligence, I built some tools for doctors to improve their productivity and their administrative work. And that combination of my clinical experience and new technical knowledge really gave me the encouragement to wanted to like launch my own thing. And it was then when I started getting really interested in clinical safety and data security and compliance, because I realized, okay, built something potentially useful, but how do I make sure it's safe, secure, effective? What are the practical steps to deploying it? And that's when I did my clinical safety officer training around then, and I've been a clinical safety officer now for many different digital health suppliers, so on the supplier side. And then this kind of led me on a journey to starting Assuric, which is what I currently do now. I'm co-founder, CEO of Assuric, which we can potentially touch on in more detail. But high level, it's an automated compliance platform specialized for digital health. So we help both digital health and companies and healthcare organizations manage everything from clinical safety, information governance, and all of those things that are required to ensure digital health products are deployed safely, securely, and effectively.
No, that's great, Paul, and thank you for that. So I just want to rewind though, and just sort of like get a little bit, dig a bit deeper, get a bit more information. So what took you into medicine? In relation to sort of, what were your drivers? What were your aspirations? Did you always want to be a doctor in relation to that?
Yeah, so I had always wanted to be a doctor throughout kind of my time at school. I was always interested in more scientific topics and the scientific process, but also wanting to be involved, work with people, have that kind of human contact. Again, the kind of problem solving aspect really appealed to me, so that led me to do medicine. And then once I was doing medicine, I really enjoyed the whole process of, especially the kind of diagnostic process, working out a problem, potentially solving that problem for a real person, and then realizing that impact and having that immediate impact. I really enjoyed that, and I still do. It's one of the reasons why I still practice clinically, is I really don't want to give up that kind of patient contact, that clinical exposure. I think it's really rewarding to me, and that's something I really enjoy, and I think it complements my work in digital health quite nicely. And I actually think there should be more sort of opportunities for people to continue clinical work whilst having other interests. But yeah, it can be challenging based on the kind of educational structures as they are at the moment.
No, you're absolutely right. And picking up on that point, I'd sort of like, definitely from my experience as well. So, and the reason I asked about sort of like, whether you wanted to be a clinician from like sort of like, day one and like aspire down the line, because it's quite interesting. A lot of the nurses that we've had on the podcast, etc. A lot of them sort of fell into sort of like nursing. It wasn't their, they didn't come up through school saying, "Oh, I want to be a nurse," and sort of like
Yeah.
that's what they aspired to. Whereas you find a lot of the time in the sort of like medical profession rather than sort of like nursing, that a lot of people do aspire to be sort of like doctors in relation to that. But picking up on a point, it's quite interesting you saying that transition into digital health. And there's a lot of clinicians now, aren't there, that are venturing into digital health, and I think it's absolutely essential, because that clinical engagement, as we know, from that whole clinical risk management, the design development life cycle as well, and being exposed to that is absolutely key. But then if you flip that on its head, and like you just said about the importance of maintaining your clinical practice, because I'm a big believer in that. And it's just through circumstance that I had to in 2020 stop practicing as a nurse. But I'd love to get back into clinical practice. But even though there's a real shortage, it's not that easy, and it's not that attractive for health organisations when you're saying, look, I can give 1 or 2 days a month in relation to that. It's not attractive, is it, in relation to that? And it would be really good for speaking to the audience now, if anyone out there is sort of like knows of any sort of like initiatives away. I know lots of people say to me, "Oh, just join the bank or just get on the sort of like but again, that's not necessarily sort of like a way forward if you're looking for consistency in relation to that. But so coming on to your sort of like your clinical practice, and like you said, that patient interaction, you probably came into clinical practice at a time as well where digital was starting to come into the forefront. So how did you? What significant challenges were there that you encountered in your clinical practice where you looked at digital and thought, hang on, there's sort of like a need here, or sort of like, we can support or fill that gap, or support that process with sort of like, digital technologies?
Yeah, I kind of always thought that from, again, going back to medical school. It was one of my first clinical rotations where helping the doctors out doing lots of jobs, and I was doing things like bleeping other specialties using the switchboard and the bleep system. And that, to me, coming into the system afresh, I was absolutely baffled by the sort of inefficiencies in that way of communicating with someone.
Yeah.
And I mean, that actually led me to work on just a basic phone book app in medical school, which was called Hospital in Hand at the time. And at the time, I thought this was quite an interesting project to do. I very much saw it as a quality improvement project alongside my clinical studies, and sort of after graduating and sort of working as a doctor, that wasn't a priority. Looking back, I feel like it could have been something that could have been expanded into something incredibly useful, because it was used in two hospitals, and it was kind of similar to the induction app, which lots of listeners might know who's worked clinically, which again is a kind of phone book app to try and avoid the need to call switchboard and wait to be connected, which is an inefficient process. So that's kind of what got me started. And then just, I mean, there'll be loads of other people who have stories like this, but as you start working in these systems, compared to what you're used to outside of healthcare, the use of technology is quite poor. So I mean, for one, there's lots of paper-based systems, so that was already always a source of frustration, copying out paper drug charts, all of these kind of things. And then even when I worked at the hospital with an electronic health record system, the poor user experience, the multiple clicks, the slowness of it was again something you felt like could be much improved. And I mean, even at the time, this was back in my foundation years when working, I was at Imperial working with the Cerner system. Again, I was young and I wanted to kind of change things and improve things. So I wrote a long email of lots of user feedback points, which I emailed to Cerner and a clinical lead, which I thought was very valuable user feedback. But of course, I thought it might go somewhere, but it didn't really go anywhere. And that's the first time I felt potentially pretty powerless to actually make a change, especially in that role at the time as a foundation doctor. But yeah, I mean, there's loads of other examples of poor technology in communications, in interoperability between different systems, in just poor technical infrastructure. It doesn't even need to be the flashiest technology, just even the basics was pretty frustrating to work with, and those challenges still exist today.
And it's really interesting you talking about, you know, your experiences in relation to sort of writing that email to sort of like, you know, to the clinical lead at Cerner. And from my perspective, if that was me with my sort of years of experience and sitting there, you know, I'd sit up and listen. I'd definitely reply, and I would take that on board as a positive, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? As we know, sort of like, you know, that whole feedback loop in relation to making improvements and for products to move on. That's absolutely key, because if you're not getting that clinical engagement and that feedback, then how can you improve your product? If you're just doing that in an insular way in-house, then your product's not going to improve. It's just going to go like that, isn't it? On a sort of like on a line. You think you're improving it, but you're not actually. All you're doing is just sort of like, you know, you're just making tweaks or just tightening a nut here and there, and that's about it in relation to that. So. Yeah, and I think we're still at this moment in time in a situation where clinical engagement is a massive issue, especially with sort of like, I don't know what your experience are in relation to that, and maybe sort of looking at that potentially from an Assuric perspective. I know you're at an advantage, because I know in Assuric there's clinicians, your clinicians working in there, so that's a great advantage in relation to that. But we all need that clinical engagement, don't we, for our systems to improve them. And I don't know, you know, your experiences in relation to that. Were you even asked in on your journey as a clinician to give feedback for sort of like the improvement of systems?
Generally not. I do think, I completely agree. I think clinicians should be heavily involved in both kind of the product development phase, user experience, and also critically clinical safety. That of any digital health provider, either in the founding team or in the sort of leadership team, there should be a clinical presence. I mean, health technology, health is one half of the word. Digital health, I mean, clinicians should form a key part of that, and we've seen various suppliers or companies without that kind of clinical leadership and the challenges that they can face. So I think, yeah, involving clinicians in product development, in clinical safety is vitally important, and ultimately will lead to safe and effective products for sure.
And why do you think that is, Paul, that we don't see? And I completely agree with you. I mean, sort of like we also work with, you know, a number of sort of like startups and SMEs that don't have clinical representation within their organisations. And do you think that's like a resourcing issue, or by choice that some people don't, or just a lack of awareness or knowledge in your experience?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I do feel like it's changing to a degree, as there are many digital health companies now founded by clinicians or with clinicians in leadership positions. I think partly it's because you don't just need clinical experience to build a digital health company, a health tech company. You need a lot of technical ability, you need commercial experience, and those things are incredibly important. So it's that mix of skills and experiences is ideal, and it can be challenging to find that mix potentially, especially when clinicians can be very focused on clinical work. So I think it's only in the last few years now that there's more opportunities for clinicians to sort of find opportunities outside of clinical work in digital health companies, or start their own project. So I think that's a change that we're seeing increasingly, which is a good thing, I think.
No, absolutely, and I think we are seeing more, like you said, more startups that are being sort of founded by clinicians, which is a great start point. It's when I think I struggle when you see some startups that have come from other industries as manufacturers, as sort of like technology sort of like developers, and try to make their way into health because they think they can make a difference. And slowly but surely, unfortunately, a lot of them find that they're better off staying in the markets that they know, because there's incumbent risk in relation to that as well, and we don't want that to pass on to the patient, which leads us quite nicely onto sort of like passing risk on to the patient, that whole sort of regulatory compliance piece. And like sort of you've talked about your history in sort of like becoming a CSO as well, and it'd be interesting to sort of like to talk a bit about that journey, and what defines that whole assurance piece, and what was the drive then to sort of get into okay, I'm going to develop an assurance platform, because that's a big piece of work, isn't it? It's not just like sort of and for anyone, we will come on to talk about Assuric and the platform, but obviously I've seen and used the platform, and it's a lot of work that's gone into that, and it's something that's going to be an absolute game changer within the sector. So yeah, talk us through that bit between sort of clinical safety officer and then sort of like leading into sort of like the Assuric journey.
So as you said, it goes back to, I kind of had this many years of now clinical experience. Then I kind of developed more of my technical and AI knowledge and experience, and that led me on to wanting to skill up in clinical safety, realizing the need, if you want to deploy technology into healthcare, for it to be safe. And that was, I recognized that was a knowledge gap of mine. And of course, if you're operating in healthcare, it's a high risk industry. Any digital health technology that's being used, ultimately there could be a patient at the end of it, of which harm could be realized. And that really what motivated me to make sure that this was being done properly. And so that's when I started learning about clinical safety, learning about clinical risk management, applying it to some of the tools I was developing.
Yeah.
And then sort of learned about it more, spoke to lots of digital health companies, and lots of people. I found there was quite a significant misunderstanding, or lots didn't realize exactly what needed to be done. A lot saw it as a barrier when it came to compliance, and not just clinical safety, but information governance, data security, medical device regulation, clinical safety. Or I found it to be a universal pain point among suppliers. Some saw it as a box ticking exercise, all saw it as something time consuming, costly. And I thought, there's potentially an opportunity here to both sort of upskill people or improve the quality of compliance, and ultimately kind of aligned with a larger mission of mine to ultimately accelerate the kind of deployment and adoption of safe, secure, and effective technology in healthcare. So this is a problem that Matt and I were working on. Matt is my co-founder of Assuric. He's a excellent software engineer, amazing, worked at Palantir for a few years. And we were both very aligned in wanting to sort of try and improve technology in healthcare, partly from my experiences working within healthcare and Matt's experiences as a service user of healthcare and having frustrations from that side. And then we realized that maybe if we can help digital health companies comply with what they need to, then we can ensure that lots of great technology, which is safe, secure, and effective, can be deployed. And then we realized that this space was very tech immature. So companies were managing sort of lots of complex workflows across multiple documents and spreadsheets. There was a lot of complexity, not full understanding of what needed to be done or how it should be done. And we felt there was a great opportunity to consolidate this in a software product to simplify a lot of the work, automate what can be automated, produce the evidence that everything's done properly, and kind of streamline that process of adoption into healthcare. And since we've been doing it for over a year now, it's been absolutely fantastic, and we've loved it.
Yeah, and I think coming back to what you said before about sort of like, you know, your experiences of that whole regulatory landscape is very varied, isn't it? We're still at a point sort of like, you know, and I don't want to keep harping on about sort of like the standards and sort of like, you know, their revision and where we need to still like sort of however many years down the line, because they've been around for quite a while now. And we're still at that point where it's not a level playing field, and people like the amount of awareness, it still needs to be, we need to up our game completely. And that you're absolutely right. We keep harping on about sort of digital health technologies, and like you know digital health and technology, and then you look at a clinical risk management file and it's using Word, Excel, and all these sort of, dare I say it, they're not antiquated, but you know, they have a use, and they are used with anger. But this is the problem, that people are too set in their ways, and we're in our comfort zone. And I think we're seeing this first and foremost around the pushback that potentially manufacturers get around trying to do things in different ways. So we are now seeing, you know, the likes of Jura, DevOps, you know, apologies for the audience, for those that don't know, sort of like Jura and DevOps are development management tools for sort of like, you know, raising tickets, etc. Paul, I know you're sort of well rehearsed around these areas. And we're seeing people using digital technologies to surface, manage their risk management, their regulatory compliance in a constructive, you know, structured, workflow driven manner, which just makes sense. I mean, I don't see how. Well, I'm still trying to rack my brains with how we're in 2025 and we haven't done something like this for however many years. And you know, I think I was lucky enough to get exposed to the first Smart 2, and I know NHS England won't mind me sort of talking about this because it was out in the public domain. You know, the Smart 2 product that was sort of, you know, but it just petered out. It didn't really go anywhere, and it was probably due to funding, etc. But it was a rudimentary model, but it did what it said on the tin. It was trying to, you know, it was workflow driven, and it really did help. It really did help. And I think one of the biggest advantages for me, for these sort of tools, and like including sort of like, you know, your own at Assuric, is that what it does, if they are done properly, it forces people back to basics. Because I think within the sector and within the CSO community as well, and I don't mind sort of like saying this, sometimes we do get lazy in relation to, and I'm not saying by anyone's fault in relation to that, but sometimes you've got lots of projects that happen in, and we tend to, don't we just psychologically we just fall into a pattern of how to do things. And what we need to do, we need to step out of that. You know, I'm fortunate enough that sort of like we do regular training, and that keeps me totally grounded in relation to what I'm doing, because you are taken back to basics when you are training every single time that you train. And that's a real advantage. But I think without these tools, and without us being sort of like driven by that workflow, because lots of people don't realise, you know, there's a lot to regulatory compliance. It's not just, you know, for those manufacturers out there that think it's just a box ticking exercise, they're sadly mistaken, but it's not. It should it should be one of the key drivers for your organisation in relation to what you're doing. Sorry, is host having a bit of a soapbox moment about regulatory compliance. But I think you've really sort of like hit the nail on the head in relation to sort of like, identifying that, there's technologies that we could use, and you've forged forward in relation to that. And it would be great to sort of like, for us to just have a chat around Assuric and that sort of like, what the platform is, what it's doing, what it does support in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
In relation to that, if you're happy to do that. Now, I will say to the audience that we won't, we're not doing, this isn't sort of like, we're not doing a product demonstration, etc. However, we will be talking about the Assuric platform, and we're talking about it for a reason, because it's a great platform. It's there to help and support manufacturers, health organisations in their regulatory compliance pathways, and all I can say is it totally does. And if anyone does want a sort of like a demonstration from Paul and their team, or are interested, if you're sort of listening and watching, we're going to put all contact information in the introduction for this episode. But Paul, if you can just give us a bit of a background about sort of like where it started and the where was your initial concentration in functionality for sort of your starting point for Assuric, and then how it's sort of like the platform's grown to support multiple sort of regulatory compliance pathways.
Yeah, and you make some excellent points, Dean, and there are loads of advantages to existing tools that you mentioned, documents, spreadsheets, and I'll come on to them, but it's definitely a move that's needed in terms of, I'll come on to all the benefits, but I completely agree. When it comes to where we started, so the first kind of product we built, or feature we built, was around clinical safety specifically. So partly because of my background in clinical safety and the complete lack of tools, this is over a year ago now when we started building our initial product. We focused very much as a starting point on the hazard log, which is in line with DCB standards, and optimizing that risk management workflow. And kind of, as you've mentioned, the status quo is often quite unwieldy spreadsheets, and I've seen hazard logs which have 20 plus sheets and many rows and different sort of it's a complete mess, and nothing talks to each other. And I think personally that itself is a risk, because how can you have a good oversight of the risks of your product, what controls have been implemented, what's going on, what information you need to show to which people at which time when you're using a tool like that. So that was kind of where we got started, and we built an optimized hazard log where it'd be far easier to add new hazards. We can surface suggestions based on what a product does. And one of the things we really wanted to make clear from the start, and you mentioned this, is that kind of training piece. And not only can a sort of seasoned clinical safety officer use this, but say maybe a beginner clinical safety officer, and it will guide as you go and give helpful information, training videos. And I think that's going to be increasingly important as we see increasing need for clinical safety officers, but there definitely being a kind of skills gap, and especially with resource constraints in the NHS, that's something that's only going to potentially worsen. So having a tool which can upskill people and educate whilst ensuring high quality clinical safety work is done was one of kind of goals from the outset. So that's where we started, and now we've come a long way since then. And you can, as a kind of from the focus of the supplier, and we now are working with healthcare organizations as well, you can log in, have a complete oversight of all of the sort of regulatory or standards that you need to comply with, see what points you're meeting, where the gaps are, and then if there are any gaps, we have specialized workflows in order to complete that work. It could be, maybe it's advised that you have this specific document in place which you can add, or we can suggest an example. then you can help work through that from a document management point of view and make sure the right person's read it, it's been approved by the key people, it's available to all the key people in an organization. There's the risk management piece you mentioned, which we've optimized compared to a spreadsheet, which isn't hard. But not only is it kind of reducing those time-consuming manual workflows, but also pulling key information, executive summaries, sort of highlighting key hazards. And then you mentioned Jira. We're also working on integrating with other key systems. For example, maybe you've created the control, but how do you track its implementation end to end? And then create the evidence for that and store it in one place, and then display that to a deploying healthcare organization. That is a challenge with existing tools, spreadsheets, but we're making that a lot easier with Assuric. And then again, training can be built into the platform, and it is built into the platform. And not only that, but you can track who's done what training, and you can review that on a 6-monthly annual basis to ensure that people continue to maintain their competence. And then there are loads of other features as well, but that kind of gives you a flavor. We're also adding loads of automated features when it comes to, say, producing key documentation, pulling from your risk management, your hazard logs, creating clinical safety cases in a lot more efficient way, and we're adding in many AI features to kind of streamline that documentation whilst continuing to have human oversight at all times. So yeah, and that's just to mention the clinical safety features. We've also added lots of features around data security, information governance, including automations to ensure that basic security controls are implemented across an organization, as an example. So a whole host of stuff, but just to give you a kind of a flavor of what we can do.
No, that's great. That's great, Paul, and sort of like obviously being a user of the platform as well. You know, I can see sort of like straight away. I mean, sort of one of the key advantages from my perspective is that whole audit trail, you know, being sort of like, you know, quality management system driven and being a sort of internal auditor for QMS. It's sort of like absolutely key that you've got that evidence base and that audit trail. And this is something that I think that the Assuric platform does really well. You know, you said about the whole training piece. I mean, massive bugbear of, I think, everybody within clinical risk management, and I've seen it a lot recently, is the whole sort of like, you know, document control, etc. And like you said, you know, before, if you've got numerous projects, numerous documents, hazard logs, clinical risk management plan, safety case reports, etc. I would challenge any sort of like CSO or consultancy out there that hasn't got one date wrong or version number wrong or there's inconsistency within. And I know it's a big bugbear, and I know that sort of like, you know, there'll be the Adrians out there and other people that will be sort of like, you know, on that. And we are all sticklers and we all want to get it right. But in the real world, you know, these things do happen and we're only human and we make mistakes. So if we can introduce sort of, you know, workflow into that, and, you know, a system that's going to drive and sort of, you know, give you reminders and notifications to say, you know, those documents need reviewing or that document needs up versioning, etc., and stuff like that, and does it in that sort of like that, you know, almost supporting you with automation, then, you know, that's absolutely fantastic. And I think it's also reiterating to the audience as well, is that, you know, when you mention, Paul, around sort of like, you know, because obviously I've seen how it can produce sort of like safety case reports and bringing information in, but the beauty is that that information that it's bringing in is information that CSO or that team have created. It's not sort of like, you know, yes, there are sort of like templates that you create yourself, but I think that's the beauty of it, in that you can have control over that. In relation to, so when you are creating those documents, it is the content from the clinical safety officer and from that team that have contributed to that in that respect. It's absolutely great. And I mean, Paul, you've mentioned about sort of like the clinical risk management side of it and some of the other sort of like areas, but also, I mean, there's a number of sort of almost modules, isn't there, or plugins in relation to other regulatory compliance. And I know sort of like, you know, there's more to come as well in relation to that within the platform. So it's something that sort of, you know, really looking forward to continuing to sort of like to use. So we've spoken about sort of like that whole journey into sort of like, you know, regulatory compliance space, and, you know, the need for use of sort of like technologies and platforms, which I think is sort of like, you know, is paramount to the success of effective clinical risk management moving forward. We can't sit with Word documents, Excel, and all that sort of stuff moving forward. But I think what that brings is the challenges of, so we've got health organisations, okay? And I know, like, sort of, you know, it's like a big promotion of the platform into health organisations. But we have this, what I'm finding at the moment is that we've got, you know, you try to explain to health organisations that, oh, we use a platform, or we're going to be using a platform, and then you get this sort of like, you know, oh, but we want it in Excel, and we want it in Word, and we want it in sort of like all of these. So sort of, you know, so within the platform, so taking the hazard log, for instance, I mean, you know, what are the capabilities within the Assuric platform to be able to sort of like, you know, it's all well and good that we've got the information in there. It's like, but people want to get it out of the system, don't they, as well?
Yeah, no, exactly. And we recognise that, and we recognise that's going to continue. I mean, we do envisage a world where, say, a supplier's using a platform, a Assuric platform, a healthcare organisation's using it to
totally.
their clinical risk management and supplier due diligence, and then you can easily communicate, feed information through. You can feed the hazard logs, you can query it, you can communicate with the supplier, especially when it comes to post-deployment monitoring and incident management. The key incidents could then be fed back to the supplier. So that's very much where we want to get to. But of course, that will take a bit of time. But we're having active conversations with healthcare organisations. But of course, the spreadsheet at the moment, for better or worse, or for worse, is the kind of industry standard in terms of what people expect. Although I've seen now reformatting a kind of in a different, more logical order away from a spreadsheet. So that's something we can also export. But essentially, any information in the Assuric platform can be exported in ways that you would expect. So a document can be exported as a document file, a hazard log or a risk register can be exported as a spreadsheet, either an Excel file or an online spreadsheet like a Google Sheet, and those can be shared very easily. And you can also, if you wanted to just share a view-only version of a hazard log, you could do that at a click of a button, share that, including any evidence attached to it, such as control evidence. Very easy to do. And so, yeah, that's all possible. And it's also possible to import from an existing spreadsheet into the platform as well, either from the supplier side or the healthcare organization side. So we recognize that spreadsheet is going to continue, at least in the short, medium term. So we want to make that interoperability sort of very easy and a part of what we do. So we thought a lot about that.
And I'm sure it'll also have its advantages in relation to. So we've spoken about medical device regulation, and as well. And I know there's some work you're going to be doing sort of like around that 13485, which is music to my ears. And we've had a lot of conversation. So we've had the focus groups, as you know, around the DCB 0129 consultation. And for those people listening that don't know, so DCB 0129 and 160 are up for review nationally, and there's been a number of focus groups that have happened. I was part of one of those focus groups, and there was a lot of mention around 14971, and again, for the audience that doesn't know, that's the ISO around risk management for medical device, and was really effectively the birthplace of DCB 0129 and the methodology and principles that are used in relation to that. But as we know, Paul, and we've discussed this sort of like, you know, offline around the whole sort of like, you know, there's a lot of gripes and sort of, you know, in the manufacturer space where you've got software as a medical device now, and, you know, manufacturers are producing technical files, you know, their clinical evaluation reports, declaration of conformity, etc., in a format and a language that not necessarily all CSOs understand. Don't get me wrong, they'll understand the terminology, but won't necessarily be able to then translate that to DCB 0129. And I think there's a whole piece of work to be done around supporting that transition in relation to that, and helping manufacturers really, so that they're not getting sort of bitten by sort of like, you know, this, and that, you know, you're getting health organisations that are sort of like, you know, that are pushing back in relation and challenging and saying, well, you're not 129 compliant. And I think a lot of that is in relation to the lack of knowledge and understanding in relation to that. So it'd be really interesting to sort of see where, you know, a platform like the Assuric platform could assist in that respect.
Yeah, exactly. You make excellent points. And like you said, we had the focus groups, and I was pleased to see, especially in our focus group, there people maintain that there should be a mandated clinical risk management standard for any digital health product, be it medical device or not. And that was great to see, because as you would agree, and you don't have to be a medical device to introduce risk to patients. And we've seen it with cases of electronic health records and sort of communication tools, patients not receiving correspondence, letters, harm resulting. All of these incidents in the past demonstrate why clinical risk management is key for not just medical device companies, and that's why the DCB standards exist for good reason. I think we will be looking at a kind of harmonization, or at least a recognition of the clinical risk management work that medical device companies have already completed, and sort of using that as a base point to then do clinical risk in relation to DCB standards, either maybe a few additional considerations on the manufacturer's side, and then the deploying organization being able to use that evidence to do their own risk assessment and their 160. I think one of the benefits of, say, using a platform like ours is it would be easy to manipulate existing risk management work. Say you've done your 14971, you could easily create that into a 129 risk register, flag which hazards or controls are transferred over to the deploying organization, so you could communicate that in an effective way. So yeah, it's definitely an area we're looking at. I don't think that, say, medical device companies shouldn't have to meet the DCB standard, or at least there should be a kind of an easing of the process. But I think it's important that the risk management work they've done is still communicated to the deploying healthcare organization, which isn't a requirement of medical device regulation, because it only needs to be communicated to the external auditor, the approved or notified body, but not the deploying organization. So I think the deploying organization has a right to review the risk sort of work that's been performed by a medical device company. So those are some important considerations that we'll need to keep, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's all in that translation and communication, so that both parties understand exactly what's being presented to them. Because I think this is the real difficulty at the moment, is that, you know, if a health organisation doesn't see it like sort of, you know, square hole with a square going through it, and you know for them, they're getting presented with a circle, and they're trying to jam it into a square hole, and they're like, well, it doesn't fit. So, and it's like, well, no, actually, look, if you shave those sides off there and do that, it does. In relation to that. So yeah, we need to, and I think we need to do that sooner rather than later, because I'm finding that coming on sort of, you know, quite a lot. We're getting quite a lot of questions and challenges in relation to that. We really need to sort of try and sort of like, you know, try and manage that as much as possible.
Yeah,
and I think also sort of, you know, with the sort of the whole consultation and what's happening with DCB 129 and 160, I think it's the opportunity, isn't it, for people to embrace platforms, you know, and technology in relation to that. So, right, you know, if we're getting updates and we need, you know, there's a big call for improved guidance, then a platform's the way forward. in relation to that. So the opportunities and in relation to sort of like, you know, digital health, it's moving at 100 miles an hour at the moment.
Yeah.
And you know, which means clinical risk management and that whole piece is just going to sort of like, you know, is just going to be even more onerous on both manufacturers and health organisations. And then we bring in, you know, we have to talk about AI. Otherwise, it's hot topic, isn't it? At the moment, it's just like it's huge. So that whole sort of, you know, we've got a population out there of you know, healthcare professionals that are really keen to move forward with AI technologies, and health organisations are being put under, I think, quite a lot of pressure because there's a lot out there in the news, isn't there, around the efficiencies that can be sort of, you know, put in place around sort of like, you know, these technologies. However, there's a huge knowledge gap in relation to sort of like, you know, what we know, and it's very varied. What's your take on that, Paul, in relation to, you know, what we can do and how we should be, you know, what's the direction of travel in respect to what you see in relation to AI at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge because, like you said, we're going through a wave now of digital transformation, AI. The number of digital health suppliers is exploding, which is a great thing because we need that innovation, those new technologies to have a positive impact. But alongside that comes a big kind of knowledge and skills gap. And like you said, healthcare organizations are kind of expected to keep up, deploy these tools, but also ensure that the assurance and due diligence is done to make sure they're safe, effective, secure. And that's one of the challenges. And both the healthcare organization and the regulators like the MHRA are struggling to kind of keep on top of the huge amount of work needed. So it's definitely a challenge. And I mean, the clinical safety officer role, as we know, it will become increasingly important. And it's incredibly important, but also a role which needs quite a mix of skills and experience, ideally. So not only ideally should you have clinical experience, or you should do by the nature of the standard, and that's an area which some could debate if someone's adequately trained without clinical experience, which is a topic of another conversation. But not only that, but you also need technical experience, and specifically extending to AI now, if you're going to kind of safely risk assess AI, having some AI knowledge is important. And then also around kind of clinical safety experience and skills. So there's a big mix that people need, and there's going to be some catching up to do in terms of training and upskilling people in healthcare organizations and suppliers in order to do this work properly. And that's, I think, going to be increasingly important because ultimately, yes, we need these technologies deployed, but they also need to be appropriately risk assessed and assured. And then this also extends into medical device regulation. This needs to keep up with the kind of pace of change. I mean, you use the kind of AI to improve administrative tasks. The main use case we're seeing at the moment is with AI scribe tools, which are being deployed wide across healthcare organizations now. And there's a lot of talk about safety considerations with these tools, whether they classify as a medical device. Of course, they're now being sold and deployed on the open market outside of medical device regulation. So that's an area to watch because they may come under increasing need to be regulated as a medical device. But at least we have here, they would also need to comply with the DCB standards. So they should all have an appropriate clinical risk assessment performed prior to deployment anyway. But yes, there's definitely going to be increasing needs as we deploy more digital health technologies and AI into healthcare, for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, apologies to the audience if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. There's Yeah, I think with AI at the moment, I think you're absolutely right. The role of the CSO, it's quite concerning actually, because the training, I don't like to call it CSO training. Lots of people say, oh, CSO training. It's clinical risk management training in my eyes, because you're absolutely right in what you said. It's not just CSOs that need that training. It's a whole raft of people, I think, that benefit from that.
Yeah.
Anyone that's directly involved in contributing to clinical risk management and that whole process and the activities in relation to that should have an amount of training in relation to that. And then you bring AI into that. And so where's the AI element of clinical risk management training? Is there, nationally? I don't think there isn't in relation to that. And that whole role. But then what about the general workforce in relation to AI and the adoption? And I know there are more courses, there are more sort of like initiatives that are coming on board, but I think we need to sort of also look at that whole governance piece in relation to, as we know now, there's guidance to 14971, which is 34971 for AI technologies, and we've got 42001, and so apologies again to the audience reeling off these numbers. So 42001 is artificial intelligence management system that has come out recently, well, within the last year, and 30440, which is around the validation of data in relation to AI. However, none of these are mandated. There is no mandation of what you must do in relation to AI. However, AI is a big part of technologies now, and we can't get away from that fact that they are. And do we need to see sort of mandation of some of these? Are we as a nation going to be adopting or looking at the EU AI Act? We tend to sort of follow suit, don't we? After, like, someone brings something out, and then we'll sort of like adopt it, so that moving forward. So yeah, I don't know, where do you see all that sort of like moving, Paul, in sort of like the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it will be interesting to see what
putting you on the spot.
No, it's great. It's interesting to see where the UK will go, because we've kind of stated that we're not going to regulate it as heavily as the EU. Of course, you mentioned the EU AI Act, so we may take some inspiration from it, but we're definitely positioning ourselves as not, at least at this stage, until we know a bit more about it. And when we're discussing AI in this context, maybe we're talking more about newer AI, like generative AI. So we'll see where we go with that. I think ultimately, at least in the healthcare, we have existing regulatory frameworks around medical devices. So any AI that is classified as a medical device will still need to meet all of those requirements around safety and quality and effectiveness. The additional considerations that you would need to look at for AI around fairness and bias and transparency, all of these things are elements that we'll need to consider. And I think there should be guidance. You mentioned existing standards that aren't mandated, and they can form a good framework. But it will be interesting to see what will be mandated from a regulatory point of view. But yeah, definitely an area to watch for sure. So not entirely sure on that, but I do think we're not necessarily going to adopt the EU AI Act, at least not in the near term.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think we can take some solace in that we do have existing regulation and sort of okay, we've got sort of like, we've got 129, we've got 160, and for anyone out there, you should be assessing sort of like digital health technologies that do have AI components within those frameworks. And if you look at sort of AMLAS, there's also the guidance that the healthcare guidance that's been given, produced by NHS England in relation to that framework as well. And happy to put those links onto the introduction for this episode. I think that would be really useful in relation to that. So with innovators and the way that we're moving within digital health, what would your advice be, Paul, to sort of like, anyone that's out there? Because it's quite interesting because you're not only you're a clinical safety officer, you're a clinician, you're an innovator as well. You fall into all these sort of like, you work on both sides of the fence. You work for health organisations in relation to your clinical practice, and we're moving rapidly. And then for those people that are coming into the market, or have got great ideas, because there's loads of great ideas, and you're absolutely right in what you said earlier about that we totally don't want to stifle innovation, and we totally don't want to overcomplicate these things, and we need to support innovation within the UK, because when we brought, we haven't even mentioned DTAC, which is fine, and I didn't want to sort of like bring that into the conversation. But there was lots of people when that first came out as a framework. It just confused everybody, and it just caused sort of like people were worried and saying, well, innovators going elsewhere other than the UK market because of these frameworks that you're putting in, because all you're doing is just creating red tape where it's not necessary. But anyone that's coming in with their sort of like regulatory path, like compliance pathways, etc., and sort of like their approach, what would your advice be to those startups that are coming into the UK market?
Yeah, I think it is very important to, especially at a leadership level, understand what is required, and not just a kind of very surface level understanding, but go a bit deeper. Ultimately, these frameworks and regulations are there for good reason. So as the leadership of a startup, a new technology, you need to understand what's important from a safety perspective, what's important from a data security perspective, and bake that culture in at an early stage. And then it won't be such a headache down the line when you realize you should have done all of this work and you might have to redesign parts to ensure safety and security. So I think definitely have that understanding at an early stage. And then also kind of understand that it's not necessarily something you can just outsource or sort of sweep under the rug. I've spoken to lots of people who feel like, oh, I know we need to get this done, but I don't want to know about it. I just want to know that it's done. But ultimately, you do need to understand what. I mean, it's all there for good reason. It's all important. So I think you can't outsource all of your governance. And I think it should come from kind of the top management. And I think it's important to be proactive when it comes to this stuff and not reactive. So if you realize what you need to do at an early stage, start a culture of doing it properly from the beginning. It doesn't become such a headache, especially if you use tools that can help with a lot of the work. And then you don't want to later be reactive when you realize, oh, we've got a contract, but we need to do all of this stuff, or we've got an audit and we haven't done anything, need to pull everything together, or even worse, we've had a major incident and someone's come to harm and we should have done all of this, or we've had a data breach. So I think it's important to consider these things early and leverage tools or what you can to make sure you can do it properly.
Yeah, no, it's a great message, Paul, and in relation to sort of like that whole regulatory compliance space, and I think what it reiterates as well is that we're still sort of like I keep coming back to the awareness raising, and the importance of it. And we can't. Oh, sorry, dropped my earphone now. But we can't stress enough that, you know, like you said, it has to start at that leadership level. And sometimes I think the advantages of being a startup is that there aren't so many people, and you don't have the bureaucracy, and they're not drowning in process and stuff. So it's almost nice working with a startup that you can build those platforms incrementally within the organization, which gives good foundations in relation to, like, sort of, you know, building it on rock, and, you know, introducing that culture. Whereas if you've got a big corporate or an SME that, you know, are a sort of like, you know, a large organization, and they've already got these potentially bad processes that are sort of like, you know, that have been etched into the organization, and you're trying to pick all of those apart to try and sort of get proper sort of like, you know, process and sort of understanding, and you get a lot of pushback, don't you, in relation to that. So that sometimes it's interesting, isn't it, the harder task, when you'd expect, sometimes looking from the outside in, working with this large organization, they're going to have fantastic process. And I'm not saying they don't. So for the audience, please, you know, Dean is not saying large organizations don't have good process, because there's lots of them that absolutely do and are absolutely on the money. But it can be one of those sort of like, you know, one of those sticking points within trying to get that compliance sort of and regulation done within an organisation.
Yeah, sure.
Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you on this episode. Before we sort of we finish off, I always ask this of, it's all right, put you on a spot a few times during this episode, but before we leave, I always ask our guests if there's, you know, in everything that we've talked about today in relation to sort of like, you know, regulatory compliance and that whole digital health sort of like journey, just for anyone in the audience, what would be your one takeaway in relation to that, your one sort of like bit of advice?
Yeah, I'd say if you're a digital health company, it would be, don't see compliance necessarily as a chore, but also as something that could really set your product and organization apart from the competition. And it can really help you accelerate trust with healthcare organizations and ultimately deployment. And I think if you're operating in the healthcare space, of course, safety and security will always be paramount, but ensuring that you avoid risk doesn't necessarily have to be a barrier to getting products into the hands of doctors, nurses, patients.
Brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. Paul, thank you ever so much for joining us on episode 22 of The Only Way is Ethics. And thank you to everyone for listening. Obviously, people know you can find us on Spotify and YouTube. And please go and check out the other episodes and the Women in Health Tech series that happened in February. So again, thank you for joining us, Paul, and we'll hope to speak to you soon.
Thanks very much for having me on, Dean. It's been great.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.